Gomes, thank you so much for joining us here at the Hague Summit for International Law and Human Rights and for your excellent speech. We're just going to ask you a few questions about some salient issues today. You talked about the need for doctrine in international law and human security. Where is the line between responsibility to protect and the principle of respecting sovereignty of each country?
Well, that's exactly why this doctrine is there, it's building up, we need it, because in today's globalized world, we cannot ignore what is going on in other places. The media bring it us, and we see that there are places, there are countries where indeed governments are not willing or able to enforce human rights and to protect their peoples, their communities. And the international community, because it knows, it gets the information, simply cannot ignore it. It has a responsibility to protect. If states are not able or not willing to protect the human rights of their peoples, then the international community must exercise that responsibility in different ways. And that is what the Security Council has already been saying, although inconsistently. In some cases, this was used to generate action, international intervention, such as was recently the case in Libya. But then this is also there are inconsistencies. You have as well the case of Syria, where this was not done, and as a result of a backlash of what happened in Libya, and the fact that some powerful in the Security Council, named permanent members such as China and Russia, invoked that indeed there was an overstepping of the responsibility to protect in Libya and prevented international action in support of the Syrian people. And the situation only got worse and worse, as we see. So I say that indeed, since 2005, with this concept developed by and promoted by Secretary General Kofi Annan and the panel that he created for that, we have the concept. We have indeed a number of cases where the Security Council has enacted it. But we must indeed expect a backlash from those that argue with the principle of sovereignty of the states as preventing indeed consistent action. It's important to persevere. I argue that the EU has a particular responsibility to promote this concept, to develop the concept, and of course but in order to indeed build a consistent doctrine, we need also to look at the reform of the Security Council. The selectivity now, the inconsistencies are due to the different dynamics, political dynamics in the Security Council, where P5 play a major role, where they have each one of them the veto right, and which is something, in my opinion, inconsistent with the needs for global governance, for peace and security at our age. We therefore need to move for reform of the Security Council, more representative membership, and clear restrictions on the use of the veto power.
Okay, that's an interesting answer. And to build on that a little bit, what sort of tools do the international courts currently use to promote and protect human rights within the borders of the state?
Well, states have the obligation to promote human rights. It's not just the consequence of the international, the UN Charter, but it's consequence of the several instruments for human rights that they have signed and that they have ratified, and therefore there are binding obligations for them, internationally and as well nationally. Some states, it is definitely the case of my country and several other European countries, have provisions in their constitutions to make their international obligations in international law part of the national jurisdiction enforceable by courts. So it's quite a challenge to actually make courts and the juridical professions use these provisions in the constitutions to actually enforce them nationally. But then, of course, there's also more and more countries who have universal jurisdiction. So it's not just for crimes that have been committed within the borders, but it's actually human rights crimes that have been committed anywhere else. So there are provisions for universal jurisdiction. And of course there is the recourse to international courts in the European framework. Of course, we have the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg, apart from the European Court of Justice, but we have as well, now more relevant than ever in my opinion, the International Criminal Court, which is supposed to have international jurisdiction, but can actually act together with governments to ensure that justice for human rights is upheld, and that can be done as well within borders. I recall, for instance, the effort that was going on of the ICC together with Libya coming out of the Gaddafi regime to actually cooperate in delivering justice for human rights violations of the past. Unfortunately, that has been now put on hold, but I hope it will be resumed, and it will be an interesting case to follow.
Okay, on my side, I would like to ask you some questions more on the cultural diplomacy side. So the question would be, how can cultural diplomacy serve as a tool to build bridges and understanding between different cultures in order to help international courts to enforce human rights?
I think this is very important, and not just to help courts enforce human rights, to help us all live safe in insecurity wherever we live, be it in Europe or in other part of the world, especially with the kind of threats we are now facing, in particular the threat of terrorism, which knows no borders, and which is often portrayed with so much mystification that leads to stigmatizations of communities, be it, for instance, of Islam, or Muslim communities, or migrant communities, as the extreme right-wing tries to do in Europe in particular. We need to actually invest in cultural diplomacy, to know better the others, to understand that Muslim culture is part of our European culture. We have millions of Muslims living with us. They are not should not be amalgamated with those who invoke Islam perversely to commit terror acts. They are the main victims as well of terrorism, not only in Europe, but as well in countries where the majority of the population is Muslim. They are our allies in the fight against terrorism. So we should actually promote, via cultural diplomacy, a better understanding, the culture of tolerance. I am not one of the people who think that the right to freedom of expression that we uphold so dear as a basic freedom is unlimited. We need to not let it be perverted into and to be used as an offense to communities who have that particular characteristics. I mean, if I know that portraying Prophet Muhammad is in itself an offense for millions of Muslims, whether I agree or not, I'm not even a religious person. But why should I do it? Just to offend, just to be provocative? Why should I do it? It's counterproductive. It's only going to fuel more bigotry, and it's going to play into the hands of the terrorists that invoke perversely Islam, or that feed their narrative, or feed the right wing in Europe who wants to amalgamate Islam with migrants and the difficulties, the hardships of the current crisis. So I believe we very much need cultural diplomacy, because by the way, this fight against terrorism, it's also a fight against those who want to provoke a clash of civilizations. I want an alliance of civilizations. I believe that human rights are universal human rights. It's something that binds us all together. Therefore, we need to invest in cultural diplomacy because this is also a political and ideological fight.
Thank you very much for that. And lastly, do you believe that right to culture and cultural expression should be protected as a basic human right? And how far, if so protected, should this extend?
Yes, of course. I mean, to me, human rights are not just universal, but they are also indivisible. And the Bill of Human Rights comprehends civil and political rights, but as well cultural, economic, and social, economic, and cultural rights. So cultural rights are part of human rights and need to be protected. But of course, I don't agree with those that try to deny human rights on the basis that this is not in line with their culture. If cultures are violating human rights, then they cannot be accepted as cultures. They need to be changed, and this is valid for people anywhere in the world, including in Europe. I mean, nowadays in Europe, people are very keen on, for instance, the protection of the rights of gay LGBT people, LGBTI people. 40 years ago, who talked about that in Europe? I'm not surprised that in other parts of the world this is really a fight, as it is still in Europe, in many parts of Europe. So we have to have this historical perspective. And indeed, the objective must be to eradicate from our cultures, not European, but as well any other culture, any trait, any characteristic that indeed violates human rights. And a major element of human rights is that all should enjoy human rights, equality, and freedom from discrimination, be it of race, or of language, or of ethnic background, or of sexual orientation, are the essence of human rights. Therefore, I don't accept that cultural identity should be invoked as a way to justify any kind of derogation to human rights. On the contrary, I believe that in many of our cultures, almost all of our cultures, indeed we have, in one way or another, built-in patriarchal and other discriminations that are totally inconsistent and violating human rights, and we must get rid of them.
Okay. Thank you very much on behalf of the ICE. Ms. Gomes, we thank you for your time and for answering our questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.